Good morning. The Campaign Finance Ethics Commission meeting for August 4th, 2017 is being called to order at 9:10 a.m. We will now proceed with the roll call. Commissioner Becker?
Here.
Commissioner Delaplane?
Here.
Commissioner Duarte?
Here.
Commissioner Lazar?
Here.
Commissioner Wanch? Okay. And now if you'll please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We are now on item 4, election of chair and vice chair of the Campaign Finance Ethics Commission for remainder of 2017. We are now requesting nominations.
Well, I have a question of the commission. Is there anyone here who wants to be chair? Nobody's saying no, but I see some heads being shaken.
With that, I'd like to nominate Don Becker as chair of our commission.
Second.
Okay. Sorry, here. Duarte. Okay, the motion is to nominate Commissioner Donald Becker as chair. We have a motion made by Commissioner Lazar and a second by Commissioner Duarte. And with that, the motion is approved.
We need to take a vote.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All in favor?
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. And the motion has passed.
Okay, you need to move.
Well, okay. All right, the second item on the agenda is the election of the vice chair. Do I have any nominations?
I nominate Richard Duarte as vice chair.
And do I hear a second?
I'll second.
All right. So now, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Of those opposed? Nobody opposed, so that carries. All right, the next item on the agenda is agenda review. So the consideration of the modification of the agenda. Does anybody have any changes to the agenda that they would like to suggest? Hearing none, we'll move on then. Item number 6 is public comment. You can just pile up all the request forms right there. Since there's no public in attendance, there will be no public comments. How about comments by the commission? Any comments by the commission members?
When would questions be appropriate?
What type of questions?
The kind of general questions about how we operate. Under operating procedures. Let me see, there might be.
So when we take that up, that's when it would be appropriate to talk about it, okay?
Okay.
Any staff comments? All right, so then we'll move on to item number 8, which is the consent agenda, which is item 9, review and approve unless an item is pulled for separate action by the commission. Are any of the commissioners requesting that we pull anything from the consent agenda? We only have one item on the consent agenda. And if so, if any of the commissioners want to propose changes to the conflict of interest code, now would be the time to talk about it, to let us know that we should pull that. Okay, nobody wants to do that, so we'll move to item 9. I'm sorry. Okay. On number 8, we need to, it does say review and approve.
Move
Okay, so
approval of the agenda, of the consent agenda?
Second?
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion is approved. Now, we move to the consent agenda. That is to, I'm sorry, we're moving to the item 9 on the consent agenda, which, are you saying that in our last vote, number 8, we've already approved number 9? Okay, all right. Then we'll move on to number 10. So there's proposed operating and hearing policies and procedures. Does anybody have any discussion about the proposed policies?
Yes, I had some questions that, just in terms of procedures. Are commissioners covered under any type of E&O, error and omissions, or insurance, or any type of coverage?
Sally?
There'd be governmental immunity.
Yes, there's no insurance per se that I'm aware of, but, they're governed by laws of immunity for official acts, and whatever's provided for in the statutes for immunity would be your coverage. Generally, there's immunity for your official acts taken in absent fraud or criminal act.
Great, thank you.
So then, as I understand it, what you're saying is there's no specific insurance, but there's a government code that covers this section.
Correct. There would be immunity for, for example, for someone who didn't like a decision you might make, they couldn't sue you. There would be immunity from that.
Right,
Again, unless there was some, I think, and I don't have it in front of me. I wasn't prepared, but some kind of criminal act like a bribe was alleged or fraud, then there wouldn't be immunity from that. But
Right, I was thinking more along the lines of errors. For instance, error in procedure, that later we could be subject to some type of suit or any kind of...
no, if there were errors in the proceedings, the remedy for that would be the aggrieved party to seek take a writ petition from your commission's official action and try to have it reversed or changed.
All right, thank you.
And there's a statute of limitations on that under the Code of Civil Procedure. So once that statute of limitations had expired, there would be no remedy.
Another question.
Sure.
It seems like the compliance officer is pretty much an integral part of the system. Has one been appointed?
Well, there is no compliance officer per se. There's the legal advisor, which is me, and the county counsel's office.
Okay, because in our procedures, compliance officer is...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, the compliance officer is. The compliance officer has been appointed by the Board of Supervisors. We're still working out contractual issues, but yes, there is currently a compliance officer, and I think there's a effort to have a backup as well.
Okay. And is it possible to receive a history of complaints, let's say, the last year, or just so that we could review to...
I sent to all the commissioners a link to our site that has all the complaints and complaints of apparent violations going back to, I think, 2007.
Okay, I did receive the link.
So it's online, and there are two different, one is a database, which is the most recent, The last election period, we created a database. The others are listed, and you just go to each link, and you can look at all the documents there.
Great, thank you.
And please let me know if you have any questions on that. You can call me. Okay?
Thank you. And I apologize, but just
That's all right.
the last one. I understand we're under the Brown Act provisions. Does that include closed sessions, et cetera? You know, the full gamut of Brown Act?
Yes, you are covered by the Brown Act, which means you can have closed sessions in circumstances that are authorized by the Brown Act.
Right.
For example, if there was litigation involving your commission as a party or anticipated litigation involving your commission as a party, there could be a closed session to discuss that. There are other items in the Brown Act that allow for closed sessions, personnel review, things like that. I don't know. Not all of them necessarily will be applicable to your commission.
Thank you. I think that
All right.
covers my concerns.
Any other discussion of the operating and hearing policies and procedures?
I do have several issues here with regard to the proposed rules for us, and I'd like to go through them section by section. The first one is section 304, at 3.04, our compensation. I know that some of the other Ventura County commissions have a per diem allowance for meetings, and I'd like to propose that instead of stating that it may be volunteer or may be compensated, that we change that language to enable us to have a small per diem. It won't pay us really for our time, but, you know, something like $100 an hour just and mileage just to compensate us a little bit for coming to these meetings. And so that would be one change if we want to talk about that, or if you want me to move on to the other ones and we can talk about all of them. I don't know how the chair wants to handle this.
I guess my question is this. These operating procedures, are these things that we can change, or do we have to make recommendations to the Board of Supervisors?
The latter.
The latter.
So the operating procedures have to be approved by the Board of Supervisors. Your commission's initial role with these is, because they are your operating procedures, is to approve them yourselves. They then will have to be adopted by the Board of Supervisors. These are proposed, so they're subject to discussion, and if your commission decides you want sections changed, we can make those changes before the procedures are submitted to the Board of Supervisors.
So these are new procedures. They haven't been approved by the board before. Is that correct?
Sort of. I'll give you a little history. So this is the third iteration of a commission. When the ordinance was initially adopted, there was a commission. We developed operating procedures for that commission. This was back around 2006, I think. That commission formation was then changed subsequently. It went from a 5-member commission to a 3-member commission. That was in place for a few years, so we had to revise and modify the operating procedures to adapt to that commission and some of the ordinance changes that were implemented along with it. Subsequently, the commission was eliminated, and we went to a system with a hearing officer and a compliance officer. That was the system that was in place during the last election cycle. And now, as you know, as of this year, the commission was re-implemented. So we've now had to, this is about the 4th version of operating procedures, because we have to modify them for each, as this has evolved over the years. So there's not a lot that's brand new in these, but they are tailored now for the system that is in place, which for the first time we have both a commission and a compliance officer. So a lot of the provisions here that are specific to your commission were adopted from previous versions of the operating procedures that were in place when we had a commission before. The provisions that apply to the compliance officer were taken and adapted from the last version of the operating procedures we had, which was with a compliance officer and a hearing officer. But now they've been modified to adapt to the compliance officer with a commission format. So the board has seen probably much of this in various forms over the last 10, 12 years.
All right, so Commissioner Lazar has suggested at 3.04 that there be some kind of specific language providing for some type of stipend. So my first question, Sally, is there any such thing currently?
For the commission here, there hasn't been. I have not seen any history of any compensation. I'm not sure what the procedure is. I think it probably has to go to the board. So after, I don't know, if you're not approving them, you want changes to them, then it's going to be all wrapped up into one letter.
Well, even if we approve them, they have to go to the board.
Yes,
So
but
either way, it's
if
going
you
to go
want
to the
to
board.
change them, then,
Then they'll have to be redrafted
right,
and go.
and then you'll have to meet again.
All right, so
think.
as I understand what you said, Sally, that there's been no history that this commission receive any kind of stipend or any kind of compensation for this work.
Correct.
So the question is, Commissioner Lazar is suggesting that we should make a proposal to the Board of Supervisors that they start a stipend of some kind. So I guess there ought to be discussion about this. What do the other commissioners think about this idea?
Well, to be honest, I hadn't given it much thought.
Well, now's the time.
Yeah. When I was asked to serve on this commission, I did not anticipate or did not think that there would be a stipend involved. So I'm open to that. I understand coming from a farther distance than I do. I'm from Oxnard. I can understand the rationale for at least a gas reimbursement, but or a mileage reimbursement. But I'm open to at least what the discussion is in terms of if there is going to be compensation, how much, and that type of thing.
Same situation. I was told that it was not a compensated position, so that was fine with me. But to the extent that there is going to be compensation, I'm on board for that as well.
We'll take it.
I'm driving from Simi, so it is a long way as well.
Well, I think then, and I'd be corrected by the clerk of the board, but it seems to me that this is something we probably ought to go on record as either being for it or against it. So I'm going to call for a motion on Commissioner Lazar's suggestion. Either you put it in the form of a motion and it gets seconded and we vote on it, or, but I think we need to go on record as far as this is concerned.
Okay. Perhaps what we do is, it says commissioners may be volunteers or may be compensated. How about if we say commissioners may be compensated with a per diem similar to other county commissions or something like that?
So the rate for other commissions that do receive a stipend varies. I would recommend that your commission specify what that rate is that you want to include in this document to be approved by the board. $100,
Do you have any
$50.
idea what the range is?
I could look that up and get back to you. But
No, I think
they're minimal. I would say that the most that is compensated, I think, is 150 per meeting. And so I think they range from 50 to 150 per meeting.
So do you have a number in mind?
How about if we go in the middle and say 100 per meeting?
All right, so we have, I'm going to say that we have a motion that says that we modify the language to say this commission is compensated $100 for each meeting day. And I'm sure that council will clean up this motion if we, in fact, pass it. So now, is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
There was a mention of mileage, so I don't know if you want to include that in your
Plus
motion.
mileage? I don't care.
Okay, plus, so that the
Okay,
motion
100
includes mileage, so,
I don't know if I have to take back the second or not, but I can, okay, I agree to that change.
all right, then, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, motion passes. So
Okay.
we'll need to modify that section 3.04 and submit it to the, part of the submittal. Do you have any other suggestions?
I do. I think I have three more. Section 3.05, the function.
Say it again, which?
Section 3.05,
Oh, okay.
which describes the function
All
of
right.
our commission. And I am concerned that the way this is drawn, it may be too narrow, and it could preclude us from performing certain parts of our function that are set forth in the code. And I would like to propose a change that it simply says the commission shall enforce the provisions of the county's campaign finance reform ordinance pursuant to section 1301 of that ordinance, because I think all of section 1301 talks about what our job is and our limitations on that job. So I prefer a broader statement in that section, because our duties and responsibilities, the specific ones, are then set forth in the following section 3.06. So I look at the function as more general, and the next section is the one that's more specific.
So does everybody understand the suggested change? If not, I'm certain that,
My only question, though, is that 3.05 mimics the language of 1301K, and so it's a direct quote from the ordinance itself. So
I understand, but if you look at 3.06, it then has provisions that cite to other subsections of 1301.
okay.
So if you look at all of 1301, there's numerous provisions in 1301, especially subsections J through T, that are all our different duties and responsibilities. That's why I said the function, I think, as that title implies, should be broader. And that's why I'm proposing the change. And maybe we can hear from our legal counsel if there's concerns about making that.
No, there's no concerns. I mean, the ordinance says what it says, so that's already there. You may change this, you may eliminate it completely and just do without it. I mean, it's not essential to be in the operating procedures, and if you want to make a broader statement of function that's consistent with the ordinance, that's okay also. Just be clear, to be clear though, if there is a motion, that the motion should say specifically what your commission wants that a new section 3.05 to say, so that we can just include that in the, make that revision and then get submitted to the board for adoption.
Oh, okay. I think I did provide some suggested language. Should I read it again?
Please.
Okay. It would be modified to say, the commission shall enforce the provisions of the county's campaign finance reform ordinance as set forth in section 1301.
okay, that's in the form of a motion. Do I hear a second?
I'll second it.
All right, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
The motion passes. So you'll have to get together with the county council.
I think they have the language.
And
Okay. The next one, I only have a few more, I'm sorry. Section 6.02. And
administrative staff, that section?
yes, administrative staff, and I do have a question for our staff about this in terms of our budget. Does the commission have a budget that includes the expenses that are incurred by the compliance officer, or how does our budget work?
Well, you don't really have a budget. It's the CEO's budget.
Okay.
So,
Okay, I was just concerned because if it was our budget and we were a line item, and then I would suggest that we approve any attorneys and investigators hired by the compliance officer. But if that's not something that's part of our budget, then I have no concerns about that language.
no, it's the CEO's budget.
Okay, then, moving on. This is section 10.02, representation of the commission. My concern with this is the last sentence of that section, which mandates the chair of the commission or an appointed representative to make every reasonable effort to clarify the commission's true position as soon as practicable if the press or anybody makes a misrepresentation or mischaracterization of our work. My personal workings with the press is that you can tell them whatever you want, but that doesn't mean that they're going to make those changes. And I'm just concerned that the way this is stated is mandatory as opposed to optional, and I propose that we change the language from shall to may, and that it then read shall clarify the commission's, or may clarify the commission's true position. And take out the words shall make every reasonable effort to, and as soon as practicable.
That change is actually on page 8.
That would be, yes, that would be on page 8.
And the very first word in that paragraph is shall. Are you changing that?
Oh, no, I'm looking at the very last sentence.
Okay.
The other, everything else is, in my opinion, is fine. It's just that last phrase. It says the commission through the chair or the chair's appointed representative, and I would change the language to may clarify the commission's true position, period. So that it's up to the discretion of the commission and particularly the chair if they want to do that, as opposed to requiring them to do that, because as I said, it could end up creating more misrepresentations the way the press works, and I would hate to see that, especially if we have a very sensitive case, to be required to do that. So that's just my opinion, and it's up to the rest of the commission to decide if they feel that way or not.
Any discussion?
No, I think it just provides a little more leeway in terms of what the chair has to do in terms of responding. So I'm okay with it.
As I'm-
All right.
I'm good with it as well.
Okay, then,
Should I make a motion?
yes.
Okay, so I will move that the last phrase of section 10.02 be revised to read, may clarify the commission's true position, period.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Nobody's opposed, so the motion passes.
Okay, one more area. This is under Article 14. It has the disqualification of the commission in section 1401, et cetera, and then the recusal of commissioners in section 14.06. And I do have a question of county council regarding the fact that there do not appear to be any similar provisions for the compliance officer, even though the ordinance requires that the compliance officer at least recuse him or herself if there's a problem. I don't know about disqualification, but I suggest that we might want to add that language in here as well for the compliance officer. I didn't see it anywhere else. And that section of the ordinance is section 1301 that talks about a compliance officer must recuse himself, him or herself.
Yes, that the recusal requirement does apply to the compliance officer, as well as the members of the commission. I think it was not included in here because this section was dealing with the commission itself. And of course, the ordinance requires the compliance officer to do so, to recuse him or herself as well. If you would like a section language added to just mirror that as far as the compliance officer, we could find a place to put it. There is a separate section, I think it's Article 5, that deals with the compliance officer, but it is already in the ordinance as well, so it's not mandatory.
And the other concern that I have is disqualification. There's no provisions for the compliance officer to disqualify in the event of, bias, prejudice, interest, or other good cause. And that may arise, and I'm just wondering if we should have that in the rules to enable that if the compliance officer so chooses. I understand that we are going to have a backup officer, or anticipate that we will, so that's contemplated, but should we include that in the rules? Because that is not in the ordinance.
Well, my understanding is the compliance officer is governed by a separate code section, and it reports directly to the Board of Supervisors. So I don't necessarily know if that's comes under our duties and obligations is to have anything with regards to this, the compliance officer other than work with him.
It just that some of these rules apply to the compliance officer already in this document, so I'm just wondering if we should add those in there. That's my concern, or my question.
I guess I have a question in County Council, and that is whether or not we add something. If we do add something to the rules, is it going to change the obligations of the compliance officer?
Well, currently there is no, the same standard doesn't necessarily apply to the compliance officer as to your commission, because your commission will be acting as trier of fact and making decisions. The compliance officer doesn't make any decisions. He or she will only make recommendations, and then will be essentially a prosecutor in cases that actually go to a full evidentiary hearing. And I think that's why the board did not provide for, and why we have not previously provided in our operating procedures for a disqualification like judges can be disqualified, that are included in the operating procedures for members of your commission. That would be something new and may go outside the bounds of the ordinance, but that doesn't mean it can't be put in there, because the board ultimately will be adopting these, and they can set that requirement as far as a disqualification in addition to the already existing recusal language.
Does the compliance officer have its own policies and procedures that they'll be governed by or expected to comply with?
Not at this time.
Because they're part of us. I mean, my concern is if the process is tainted prior to it coming to us, then that could taint our procedure as well. That's the only reason that I have that concern, is that, if it gets to our level and then we have to start all over, then we do have a problem.
I will note that currently appointed compliance officer is an outside attorney who would already be subject to attorney conflict of interest and conflict rules under the state bar as far as entering engagement where the attorney has a conflict. So, they're subject to that already. So I don't know this would add anything. Of course, if a compliance officer was appointed who is not an attorney, then they wouldn't be subject to those state bar rules.
And ultimately, if it comes to us as a trier of fact to make a decision, we could also investigate or determine if there is a conflict that would require that compliance officer to be taken out of the situation and maybe someone else brought in. So
But
we
at
ultimately
that
have
point,
to-
we'd have to start the whole thing all over again. That's the only, because they investigate everything, and then it comes to us based on their recommendation, especially if there's a stipulation for approval. So if that doesn't get raised until it comes to us for a hearing, then that could be problematic. But, I mean, I'm okay with this either way. I just saw the issue and I just wanted to raise it so that we could talk about it here today.
Well, so Commissioner Delaplane, are you opposed to this change?
I'm not necessarily opposed, but I don't know if it's within our ability to put that restrictions, and I guess this would be up to county council, but yeah, I don't believe that the way that the ordinance is set forth, I think that would be a separate thing that the Board of Supervisors would need to impose on the compliance officer, him or herself, rather than us imposing it on them.
We're just making recommendations. We're not imposing
Okay.
anything.
Sure.
And so this is just telling the board, if you'd like to add this language, you're free to do it. If you choose not to, you don't have to. Is that correct, Matt?
Yes, correct. The board can adopt your the procedures that your commission recommends in whole, or they can make changes themselves to it at that time.
So perhaps instead of having staff actually rewrite this section, maybe in their letter to the board, they can just indicate that the commission raised this issue and that the board can then consider it. Is that a possibility that we could do it that way? Or do we need to propose specific language?
I think you could do it either way. I think it would be best if your commission had a specific recommendation for a change that you could, that way the board would know that this was actually a recommendation of your commission rather than just a subject of discussion.
Yeah, I would agree with council's advice. It seems to me that if this is something that concerns the commission, we ought to write it in, and then when we send it to them with the rest of the recommendations, they look at that, and if they agree, they accept it. If they don't, they don't. But then they specifically know it is something that concerns the commission.
Okay, then what I would propose is that in the sections of Article 14 that reference a member of the commission, that those sections be changed. I think it would be 1401, 1402, and then 1406 to add the language, any member of the commission or the compliance officer. So we just add those words. Would that work?
I would suggest that 1405 should be changed as well. That's the provision that deals with the
Okay.
motion to compel disqualification, because that would be the mechanism. A party would have to bring a motion before your commission to disqualify the compliance officer.
Okay, so then all those sections would have language added after the word commission to or compliance officer.
So that would be in section 1401, 1402, 1405, and 1406. We would add the language or the compliance officer after the word commission in each case. Is that your motion?
That's my motion, thank you.
Any second? Well, I'll second it.
Oh, well, okay, but I just had a question. Is that language confusing though, or?
It
Should
would
it be
read,
and?
any member of the commission or the compliance officer.
Or it could be and the compliance officer.
I'm just raising the question in
It
terms of
probably
language.
should be and the
Okay,
compliance.
I'll amend my motion to change or to and, thank you.
and I accept the change as the secondary. All right, so all those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No one's opposed, so the motion passes. Any other change? Any other discussion of the rules, et cetera? Now, do we need to make a motion to accept everything as modified?
Yes, we do.
So we need
I'll let somebody
such a
else make
motion.
that motion.
So we need a motion to change the proposed operating and hearing policies and procedures as modified this morning.
Motion to approve it.
Yeah,
I'll make that motion.
okay. And do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second.
I
All
would,
those in favor?
Wait.
One point I would include in your motion, direction to staff to then submit the operating policies and procedures as modified by your direction to the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, so,
That's added to the motion unless somebody opposes that.
that's fine.
All right, thank you.
So do we need to vote?
Pardon?
We need to vote?
Yes, so all those in favor
Aye.
of the motion as modified?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? So the motion passes. Okay, that looks like we've gone through the agenda. So even though it's not on the agenda, I'll ask, are there any observations or comments by any of the commissioners at this point? If not,
I just want to thank those of you who have offered and agreed to be chair and vice chair to serving in that capacity. Thank you so much.
All right, with that, the meeting of the Campaign Finance Ethics Commission is closed.